Well, I am going to talk about nutrition, the seminar on supplementation, but in the master's program, I mainly focus on the module related to nutrition and dietetics, which is essential for ensuring that all supplementation is always accompanied by a good nutritional foundation, which I believe we all agree on, right? And above all, to make it clear the importance of having that dietary part managed by nutritionists it is important to have good patient guidance, because this is usually the most complicated part for the patient. They need close support and a lot of adaptation to their needs, as this is where the patient has to focus. Ultimately, supplementation is relatively straightforward, although taking pills can sometimes be complicated. However, the aspect of nutrition is complex because we have to adapt it to our daily lives and to the requirements we have. Well, chronic patients account for 75% of health expenditure and 80% of outpatient visits, but few of them focus on patient education. Moreover, nutritionists, who are part of the healthcare profession, are not present in the public healthcare system. There is no room for nutritionists, there are hardly any nutritionists, and if there were nutritionists, as is more common in private medical centers, let's put it this way, a lot of money would be saved, right? Given everything we are discussing today, here and now, the aspect of self-care and the need to improve lifestyle habits in a chronic patient who has a chronic condition that will not be cured is fundamental, right? The savings could be between 5.8 to 105 euros for every euro invested in interventions in chronic patients. In hospital care, many problems would also be saved. The stays of hospitalized patients would decrease. We treat many oncological patients and see that if a good nutritional approach to diet and supplementation is followed, but we will talk about the diet as I mentioned, the patient has a better quality of life, responds much better to treatments, and has greater digestive tolerance, which is very important. The current context in which we live is very complex in this regard. Moreover, when the patient comes to the nutrition consultation and is proposed a change, they are usually surprised because the healthcare system and the doctors themselves often do not take this aspect into account. Taking into account, they do not suggest to the chronic patient, for example, going back to an oncological patient, the norm is that they are told they can eat anything, that the important thing is that they do not lose weight and that they do not need to address nutritional change, that it is not necessary. Patients are even surprised, but this is the case. There is still little social awareness, although this is changing, and there is little health awareness. Who is directing or influencing our consumption habits? Since there is no health awareness, social awareness is also lacking, and cultural awareness is not strong in Spain. The media and the food industry are usually the ones directing this consumption. Fighting against it in consultations is often complex. It is very difficult to reconcile the pace of life we lead today with dietary changes. Therefore, in the consultation, the nutritionist must initially get to know the patient very well, understand their lifestyle, their peculiarities, what habits they have, whether they have family or not, because if we do not take all these factors into account, that change will not happen. Society, as we have just mentioned, is aging greatly. There is a lot of chronic pathology which results in more chronic patients. However, in medicine, the focus is on absence. In these patients, as I mentioned before, what Ayurveda medicine has done is very important. Habits need to change because otherwise, logically, in the long term, the pathology will evolve negatively. And the nutritional proposal we have is very complex. Because nowadays, going to the supermarket and being able to make a good purchase is extremely complicated. It is one of the things that patients find most difficult when we propose a change. When they arrive at the supermarket and see that 80% of those products are processed and contain a lot of substances and additives that they do not know, it becomes very hard for them to make that purchase. And in that sense, we also need to support them. Well, according to the statistics, 8 out of 10 patients fail when trying to diet. And why is this? Well, it's because the diets we know, and I will talk about many diets proposed today, are often focused on restriction rather than on the incorporation of foods. I constantly come across diets that have been given to patients in centers or what I have found on any website on the internet, because nowadays it seems that we can find nutrition or food information on any web page, I come across lists of everything I need to avoid. Well, I know I have to avoid sugars, I have to avoid refined flours, I have to avoid dairy, I have to avoid a lot of foods, but the patient really doesn't know what to eat. They haven't been given ideas, menus, or recipes on where to start, what to eat. My doctor has told me to eliminate all of this because I have hypertension or because I have uric acid issues, but what should I eat? They feel very lost. We always base diets more on restriction and do not prioritize digestive health. Many times, especially in chronic conditions, we see that the microbiota is affected. The patient usually has digestive problems, and those nutritional proposals just don't fit with that patient's digestive health tolerance. I have been told to eat fiber, to eat more fruits and vegetables, but I cannot have fructose, I cannot have fiber, I can't tolerate it, I get bloated, I have diarrhea. And so if all these food incorporations are not being monitored, the patient cannot consume what has been requested. Menus and recipes are usually not provided in the nutritional proposals made. That is given to patients, and this is also a problem because, as I said, they do not know how to manage it and do not know where to start. And the patient is not studied in their entirety. What is studied about the patient in their entirety when proposing a meal plan? Well, first is digestive health, how your microbiota is doing. As I mentioned, it is very important. Diet is a fantastic modulator of our microbiota. Now let's see. What proteins or what foods or what nutrients will help to modulate our microbiota? Aside from supplementation, if we take specific supplements to start strengthening intestinal permeability, the mucosa, and the microbiota, but we are consuming sugars, and following an unbalanced protein diet, that patient will not progress well. The supplementation will not be as effective as we desire. This is one of the main things we see in consultations, right? How is that microbiota doing? Does it have candidiasis? Is there an excess of proteolytic or fermentative bacteria? Which bacteria are overgrown and which ones are deficient? Diet should always be modulated in that regard. If there is a deficiency of nutrients, logically we need to see what those deficiencies are, but not only in the blood analysis, but also in the cellular environment, many times. There is no anemia from a specific nutrient, which is what we are discussing here, but there are micro deficits, small deficits that we need to address both with supplementation and above all with a nutritional foundation. The patient must understand that what they are going to eat will provide all the nutrients they need and that specific foods will be for each purpose. Change is very complicated. We find it difficult to change habits. However, if there is a reason for it, if each change we propose, which may not be liked at first, makes sense to the patient, then of course they will ultimately make the change and it will be successful. We need to look at the patient's baseline state, their body composition, not just weight. We shouldn't only measure body mass index and weight for height, as that is of no value. What we need to analyze is how much fat that patient has, what muscle mass, and to monitor this closely during consultations. Because if the patient is losing weight and losing muscle mass, we are doing something wrong. Because it is weakening, it is pulling from muscle fiber, so we need to balance protein consumption, and this should always be addressed in consultation. The drug-nutrient relationship, knowing well which medications are being consumed when proposing a diet. Nutrigenetics, which Ruth just talked about, is very important. We also conduct nutrigenetic studies to see what type of diet will work better or worse for individuals. How their feelings of satiety are. With genes, we can see, for example, the dietary pattern that person will have, whether they respond better to a diet richer in fats or one richer in proteins. This is nutrigenetics, and I always say that it is the patient's instruction manual, and it is very important to understand it when creating a diet for it to work. Chronobiology, both the circadian rhythms that we all have naturally and the rhythms that are conditioned by the patient's lifestyle. If the patient comes to you, for example, working shifts, you will have to adapt their diet to those shifts, even if they are not the healthiest, but it needs to be adapted. The body-mind relationship, the emotional connection that the patient has with food is extremely important. This is one of the most significant factors because it is one of the reasons for failure in changing habits, whether they like what they are eating, their emotional relationship with food, and their beliefs about nutrition, including those learned from family. All of this needs to be worked on, and for that, nutritional coaching, for example, is very important. The environment in which one lives has xenobiotics. in addition to all the toxicity present in the surroundings, and how through diet we can reduce it by eating more naturally, encouraging them to eat more organic, while also performing a good detoxification, which is important. For this nutrition approach to be complete and successful, the role of a person in charge, such as a nutritionist, is fundamental. In our clinic, nutritionists are the ones who see the patient most frequently. They must see the nutritionist at least every 15 days, while doctors see them less often. We are the ones who will address all these habit changes, which are very complex, and every 15 days they come to us with some issue. Objectives of the change, as I just mentioned, are to modulate the microbiota, to detoxify, and to help the body eliminate through the liver, kidneys, and lymphatic system. All of this must be accompanied by good nutrition. If we do not drink enough water, if we do not have regular bowel movements, and if the patient is constipated, then cellular toxicity increases. Increase the consumption of micronutrients. Nutrition has always been heavily based on thinking about macros in proteins, carbohydrates, and fats, but micronutrition is not taken into account. For example, in sports nutrition, it's very curious, isn't it? Because there is not much talk about nutritional quality. When I tell an athlete that they need to eat everything whole grain, that they need to eat chia, that they need to eat quinoa, that they need to eat seaweed, and that they need to eat foods with very high nutritional potential, they are surprised, because the only thing they were told was that they had to eat 200 grams of white rice and 150 grams of chicken, and they had not been informed whether it was organic or not. And really, for example, in athletes, it is very noticeable that their needs for micronutrients and the oxidative stress they experience are much greater, logically, due to the limits they push their bodies to. And if you provide them with good nutrition, rich in antioxidants and micronutrients, they need to eat much less. Those 3,000 calorie diets we studied in school are useless if they are not well designed and if they are not heavily focused on quality nutrient intake, apart from, of course, the supplementation they need. An anti-inflammatory action, the diet will be anti-inflammatory. It is important to properly hydrate the body and, of course, to adjust caloric intake to the calorie requirements they need, although it is important to stop counting calories. The needs for nutrients are much more important than calories. Reducing the toxic load, balancing body composition, and empowering the patient are all essential. In other words, it's all about understanding what I can do for my health, what changes are within my control, not just relying on the healthcare provider who will treat me, but that I can take responsibility for my health and do good things for it. It certainly makes the patient feel much more positive, empowering them in the face of adversity such as an illness. Therefore, therapeutic nutrition will help protect the liver, improve defenses, protect the intestines, promote the elimination of toxins, and will always be adapted to the patient's symptoms at each moment, changing according to how that patient evolves. The diet is constantly changing. There is no static diet that works for the entire process many times, although nutritional learning will remain in the long term. However, one must also learn to manage their symptoms with good nutrition. Is there a single diet that works for this? Well, there is not just one diet. Nutritionists are constantly studying different types of nutritional approaches and diets that have a therapeutic function at a given moment but are not suitable for a patient. There is no diet for a specific pathology. There are diets for patients because we are dealing with individuals who have a logical complexity. For example, when a patient comes in with bacterial overgrowth, the typical diet given to them is the FODMAP diet. The FODMAP diet doesn't work. It is a diet without fermentable sugars that alleviates symptoms. But if we have not assessed whether that patient has candidiasis, then we would need to implement a diet that is not only low in fermentable sugars, but also specific for candidiasis. Additionally, it comes with hypothyroidism, so it must be a diet that also eliminates goitrogenic foods and includes the nutrients that our thyroid needs to function. That's why I say there is not a single diet that works for everyone. Instead, we need to evaluate different strategies and see what works at each moment, but the foundation. It definitely needs to be an anti-inflammatory plan because that will help us in general to prevent diseases and to ensure that the baseline state is optimal, along with all these peculiarities that I mentioned here that need to be taken into account. Well, as I mentioned in the consultation, it is very important that we monitor the study of body composition Here I have provided an example of many studies that have been conducted on a patient. Above, we see the graph of body weight. Then in green, the muscle mass, and then the body fat. Well, this graph has worked very well because we have seen that even though weight has been lost, it has been losing body fat all the time and not muscle, right? It doesn't always happen this way. If it does happen this way, then changes in the diet need to be made, right? But this is very important and should always be taken into account. For this, we use bioelectrical impedance, which measures the different resistances of tissues to the flow of energy and provides you with a study like this, right? You can also take measurements, skin folds. There are many ways to look at it. So, an anti-inflammatory diet, which I say will be somewhat the basis for changing habits or where we need to work. What is an anti-inflammatory diet? Well, an anti-inflammatory diet will be one that ensures a balance between pro-inflammatory and anti-inflammatory fats. I don't have time to explain all of this, but it involves omega-3 and omega-6, which I believe most of us here are familiar with. Omega-3s have a function. Anti-inflammatory omega-3s and omega-6 are consumed much more in our diet today, especially in processed products. Meat that is no longer grass-fed also lacks omega-3 and has much more omega-6. Arachidonic acid is significantly increased in our diet, with omega-6 being much higher than omega-3. This needs to be balanced equally to avoid a pro-inflammatory state in our body. It is also important to maintain stable blood sugar levels, as fluctuations in blood sugar can also produce inflammation. We need to avoid sugars, refined flours, and anything that will cause alterations in our blood sugar levels. It should be very rich in antioxidants, natural, with many raw foods if they tolerate them well, of course. If not, we need to find a way for them to consume more raw foods, because when we cook them, they lose many of their antioxidants. Logically, it should be purifying and regulating for the intestines. This is a study on the anti-inflammatory diet, how it can help reduce inflammatory markers, but it is all within the context of an anti-inflammatory diet, which is what I just mentioned. And then, as I said, it can modulate the microbiota. For example, we have bacteria that are fermentative and others that are putrefactive or proteolytic. A diet very high in meat leads to more proteolytic bacteria, whereas a diet very high in fiber or in vegetables, as it will promote a more fermentative flora, which is the most beneficial for us, but this needs to be balanced. We also cannot consume only a diet rich in vegetables because we will logically have deficiencies. If we consume fiber, if we consume vegetables, that fiber will be fermented by our bacteria. They will use it and form short-chain fatty acids. They are the main fuel for enterocytes, the cells of the intestine, and will protect the intestine. Apart from the fact that short-chain fatty acids are anti-inflammatory, they will also help us at a metabolic level. It is a good nutrient for the colon, as I have mentioned. Gliadin, which is the protein in gluten, is something that also promotes intestinal permeability. It will help make the intestine more permeable because it acts on zonulin, which is a protein that affects intestinal permeability. There are studies on this, but I also wanted to mention that not all gluten is the same. Nowadays, gluten is removed from many people's diets, especially in cases of chronic conditions, which is very common. However, we have different types of gluten depending on the cereals we consume. The current wheat we consume does not have the same gluten as spelt, for example, rye or oats. There are different types of gluten, and the most inflammatory one is the gluten we consume today, which comes from wheat, because they have created a super wheat. The current wheat is a hybrid that is wonderful for the industry. It resists pests, grows very well, and produces very elastic dough because it contains much more gluten, and the molecular size of that protein is much larger. As you can see, it has 40 chromosomes, while, for example, kamut, which is the oldest wheat, has only 14 chromosomes. And this further favors intestinal permeability. So with nutrigenetic studies, looking at the patient's permeability and their tolerance to different types of gluten, often it is not necessary to remove all gluten from the patient's diet. It is simply important to advise them to avoid that wheat, which is more pro-inflammatory, and will further promote intestinal permeability. Dairy caseins, which is another protein that is also quite inflammatory, we now know that there are different types of caseins in milk. There are cows that have caseins called A2, which are much less inflammatory. Unfortunately, in the West, we do not have this type of cow. These cows are more typical of New Zealand and Australia. But now we know that depending on the type of milk protein, casein will be more or less inflammatory. And then, as we know, many people have lactose intolerance, but what is really inflammatory is not lactose. Lactose is a sugar that ferments, which can cause intolerance. If we do not have lactase, the enzyme that metabolizes lactose, it is uncomfortable and causes bloating. But what will always be more inflammatory is casein. However, as I mentioned, there are different types of casein. And then, of course, in dairy, we should consume organic dairy products because we know about the hormonal load and the antibiotics that are given to. In dairy production, mastitis in cows cannot be allowed, as it is important for us to keep this in mind. Well, as I said, with gluten, we need to see what type of gluten we consume, but cereals not only contain gluten. Sometimes the patient has problems with other substances found in cereals, such as lectins. Lectins are normally destroyed when cooking cereal or legumes. It is a protein that is also inflammatory, but if we cook that food well, it is normal for it to be destroyed. Fructans from cereals are often not well tolerated in a diet, for example, one without fermentable sugars, as these fructans need to be reduced. Additionally, we know that modern wheat, which is a wheat that also lacks a husk, has been developed this way because it is easier to cultivate and, as I mentioned, much more convenient for the industry, contains many more inhibitors of the trypsin amylase can also be very inflammatory for the intestine, which is another reason, in addition to the type of gluten we consume, why the gluten from modern wheat can be inflammatory. For us, all this is talking about the intestine and inflammation in general, meaning that aside from the foundations of an anti-inflammatory diet, all these proteins are also inflammatory, and it's important to take them into account. Although, as I said, this change tends to be quite complex because removing wheat and dairy in today's society is usually a difficult change. Well, sugar and inflammation. This is a study showing that sugar indeed increases inflammatory markers. In people who had consumed soda drinks rich in sugars, but I think we all know this by now. Other interesting dietary strategies that are used in consultations and that also need to be personalized, to conclude, include intermittent fasting. Fasting is a very good anti-aging strategy. We know that caloric restriction works very well, but it also promotes metabolic adaptation, helps us regulate blood sugar, reduces inflammation, and improves cardiovascular health. Atheroma plaques are reduced, so fasting is always a very good strategy, but the patient needs to know how to do it. Intermittent fasting simply involves fasting for 16 hours. With this, we also manage to modulate the microbiota. Normally, we do not allow digestive rest for the microbiota, which prevents it from regenerating despite having a very good capacity for regeneration. So intermittent fasting is a strategy that we also use in consultations, and it is very interesting. And then, as I was saying, there are many diets. Finally, I wanted to simply talk about the ketogenic diet. It is a diet that we use in patients with cancer, and there is also a lot published on epilepsy, such as bringing the patient to a state of ketosis through a total restriction of sugars and carbohydrates. Without that energy source from carbohydrates, the patient enters ketosis and produces ketone bodies. To nourish your body as a source of energy and to nourish our brain, however, the tumor cell, for example, cannot be nourished by these ketogenic bodies since it is a very fatty diet, providing 75% fat in its nutrition, only 5% carbohydrates, and 20% proteins. Therefore, this change is certainly complex and requires many recipes, ideas, and menus. Digestive tolerance is sometimes difficult, and we need to monitor it. And most importantly, of course, all of this should be accompanied by good nutritional education, as I have said. There are many dietary strategies, and one could talk for hours about each of them. Many of them are very good for patients, but they always need to be well explained and properly managed by a nutritionist. Thank you very much.